Hi everyone. Let's move on to day 2 of the World Rapid Championships. So going into round 6, there's a three-way tie at the top with 4.5 out of 5 points. We have Duda, Carlsen, and Jobava. So we'll follow Carlsen's games again. And in the first game, we have Jobava with the white pieces versus Carlsen. So they open with a Queen's Gambit declined. Pretty old opening. And right here, the normal move would be bishop to h4 or possibly bishop takes f6, but Jobava goes for bishop f4. Sensible move. Carlsen castles, a3, c5. So Carlsen immediately wants his share of the center. This is going to lead to some exchanging in the center, and this results in an isolated queen's pawn for black. Rook c1, hitting the bishop, it retreats, knight comes out, knight c6, bishop b5. So there's pressure on the c6 knight by the rook and the bishop, so Carlsen defends it laterally with his queen. Jobava takes on c6, curing Carlsen of his isolated pawn, but now he has these hanging pawns. Position is about equal. Bishop e5, hitting the queen. Queen goes to g6, attacking the g2 pawn. And it's safe for white to castle, which he does. Okay, Carlsen plays bishop g4, pinning the knight. He could try bishop h3, threatening mate, but that's easily defended. A couple moves that do the job would be bishop g3 or even knight h4. So bishop g4 was played, and bishop g3 was the response. Queen f6, putting more pressure on the f3 knight. Okay, queen a4, counterattacking the c6 pawn here. Carlsen takes the knight. Jobava takes the pawn on c6, attacking the queen as an intermezzo. Okay, queen takes on b2, so we get some unusual trading here. Finally, white takes the bishop, and then rook a c8. Okay, king g2 is a strange move. I'm not sure the purpose of that move. To me, it just walks directly into a pin. That pawn is now pinned. But it was actually one of the top choices by the engine, and the engine gives this all zeros. You can look at the evaluation bar here on the right throughout the games. So Carlsen takes advantage of the pin along the 7th rank. He takes on e3. Okay, then the rooks get exchanged. Queen to d7 is how white gets his pawn back, attacking the rook and the pawn simultaneously. Carlsen plays queen c2, defending the rook. Notice black cannot really defend the pawn with rook to c5 because there is queen to e8 check, picking up the bishop on e3. So the pawn's going to fall. Carlsen protects the rook, and Jobava takes on d5, and Carlsen now retreats his knight to b6. And we have a very equal position here. All zeros, and the game ends up being drawn after 68 uneventful moves. So we're going to go on to the next game. Very exciting matchup in round 7. We have Carlsen with the white pieces versus Alireza Firouzja with the black pieces. So Firouzja is all the talk lately. Carlsen recently remarked that he has little motivation to defend his World Championship Classical title unless his opponent is Firouzja, who's an 18-year-old player up and coming, now ranked number 2 in the world, recently surpassed the 2,800 rating mark in classical chess. So people have been talking about Firouzja as a potential or inevitable world champion in the future. Okay, so Carlsen has the white pieces. Let's see how he handles the young opponent. Okay, he starts with e4, and Firouzja plays a Caro-Kann. So let's see what Carlsen does with the Caro-Kann. He goes for the advance variation, e5. Firouzja plays the main line, bishop f5. And now a very unusual move by Carlsen. I've never seen this move, c4. Just pushing the pawns forward, being very aggressive, attacking black's center right away, planning on developing the knight behind the c-pawn on c3. More usual moves here are knight to f3, which is known as the short variation, named after World Championship contender Nigel Short. The line usually goes e6, bishop e2, knight d7, castles. And so white develops quickly on the king side, and he just argues that the bishop isn't doing much on this diagonal and may be misplaced, can be attacked by knights later on. This knight sometimes maneuvers over to g3 and hits the bishop. So that's a popular way to play the advanced variation. Another line I sometimes see as black is h4, which can be very dangerous. So white is threatening to push his pawns forward on the king side, and he can cause this bishop some trouble. For example, there's a standard trap here. If black makes the mistake of playing e6, then his bishop gets trapped after g4. There's nowhere for it to run, and white wins the game. So usually after seeing h4, I like to play h5. You can also play h6 in that position, and then continue from there. Okay, but we see this unusual move c4 by Carlsen, and then e6, knight c3, knight e7, and the players develop their pieces in a sensible way. Okay, pinning the knight, attacking it. So Carlsen defends it with bishop b2, fianchettoing his bishop. The bishop looks a little misplaced on this square to me, with these central pawns locked like this, but Carlsen knows better than I do. He knows what he's doing. Okay, black castles, white castles, and now black makes a pawn break here, f6, striking at the center. Carlsen takes the time to hit the bishop, drive it back, and Firouzja puts it on a5. Okay, c takes d5, c takes d5. There's a big decision to make here. I think Firouzja spent quite a bit of time on the position. C takes d5 is the safer, more solid move, but black could have gone for e takes d5 to kind of unbalance the position. So c takes d5 was played, and now Carlsen takes on f6, and then after the queen takes back, we see a structure that is sometimes arrived at in the French defense, the advanced variation, where black has already made both pawn breaks, c5, white's played c3, pawns get exchanged here, and then black has pushed f6. Now, this bishop is very well placed, so this would be a good version of the French. Usually the bishop on c8 takes a while to get over there, but in the French defense it is sometimes developed in this manner. So I think Firouzja had a successful opening here. This does give his pieces a lot of activity. His light square bishop is in the game, but he does have some structural weaknesses. He has this backward pawn, which can be a long-term target, and the square in front of it, of course, is very weak, and Carlsen would like to put a knight on that outpost in the future. Okay, rook c1, knight h4, and the knights get exchanged, and the f file is clear. The rook is well placed. There's pressure on f2. b4, driving the bishop back. Bishop g4, hitting that weak pawn right there, which is defended and blocked by black's light square bishop. Bishops get exchanged. Carlsen hits the pawn again with his queen this time. And now knight f8. So we've seen some of Firouzja's pieces moving backward in the last several moves. The knight and bishop both retreated to the back rank. But still his position is fine. I think his compensation is Carlsen's bad dark squared bishop behind all of these dark squared pawns. Okay, so knight d1, very good move. The plan is to get that knight to this outpost, so here is the chosen route. It's going to take 4 moves to get there. So Alireza gets the bishop back into the game, and then the knight goes to e3 along its route to that outpost, making a tempo on the rook. The rook goes to g5. The engine complains about that move. Probably a better move is rook to f7. That rook may be needed on the queen side at some point, and it seems to get into some trouble on the g file. Alireza is trying to be aggressive here, but the rook is simply driven away, and it becomes awkwardly placed. So the threat here is queen takes h3 because of the pin on that pawn. So white deals with that by pushing his pawn to f4, hitting the rook. And the rook, the engine says, should be put back on g6. But Firouzja is going to go ahead and put it on g3, very close to the white king, trying to be aggressive. This doesn't work out so well because Carlsen makes an excellent move here, king h2. Okay, that attacks the rook, puts pressure on it, and it also supports the pawn structure here. Okay, then there's actually also a threat in the position, which is queen to f2 or queen to e1, pinning the rook, attacking it for a second time, and it can't move away safely because the queen behind it would be taken. So because of this, Firouzja just drops the rook back now to safety. But white has an excellent position at this point. Knight g4, heading for that outpost on e5. Okay, the queen is no longer doing much on h4, so Alireza decides to drop it back and reroute it somewhere. And now Carlsen decides he needs a plan to get this piece into the game, and he has these pawns on dark squares. He's going to push them forward to the light squares and get this bishop to a3 along this diagonal. So he begins with a4, bishop c7, b5. So now that dark square bishop can get into the game at some point, but Firouzja puts his bishop on d6 first, stopping that plan. Rook c3, excellent move, multi-purpose, I think, or possible different plans with that move. For one, it does support the bishop coming to a3. Carlsen would be happy to trade off that bishop. Another idea is maybe Carlsen is planning to double rooks on the c file, or maybe even putting the rook on e3 using a battery against the pawn on e6. Okay, black plays rook c8, challenging the rook, and the rooks get exchanged, and then Carlsen sinks his knight into the nice square on e5. Rook f6, rook c1, hitting the queen rather than defending the pawn. Queen d8, now Carlsen defends the pawn with g3. Rook f5, queen d3, so putting some pressure along this diagonal, but also, again, supporting the bishop to come to the a3 square. Okay, now Firouzja makes a very aggressive-looking move, g5, pushing his pawns in front of his king can be dangerous, but he wants to attack here on the king side. But Carlsen sees this pawn has moved out of the way. That pawn used to be defending the h6 square, so once Firouzja pushes it forward, there's no defense of that square anymore, and Carlsen, of course, immediately sees an opportunity and reroutes his knight to g4, so threatening a fork here on the h6 square. So the king comes up to defend that, and then knight to e3, driving the rook back, and then f5, pushing forward past the g-pawn. Queen d7, putting more pressure on that pawn. Rook f1 defending, h6 making a more solid defense of the g5 pawn here. King g2, maybe just getting out of the way of that bishop so this pawn can advance at some point. And now we see king g8, a blunder according to the engine. And I think the point of this is this allows this pawn to be attacked. It used to be defended here by the king. And now Carlsen sees his opportunity, takes advantage with knight g4. Turns out there's no defense of that pawn. For example, if the rook moves over to defend it, then there's a royal fork. Okay, so can't do that. You can't push the pawn either, of course, because that doesn't address the fact that you're going to drop the exchange. Also, if you bring the king up to h7, then you're going to lose your queen with f takes e6 with a discovered check and an attack on the queen. So what Firouzja does instead is moves his king up to g7 to protect the pawn, but that doesn't work because of f6 check, and the queen has the diagonal covered and the black king just has to retreat. And so now Carlsen takes the pawn on h6. So Carlsen is up a pawn and has the better position. His pieces are more aggressively placed. The engine gives this as a huge advantage to white. Let's see how Carlsen finishes this off. So rook to h7, knight falls back, queen e8. So Firouzja wants to get some counterplay, maybe put the queen here, threaten the pawn on h3. But now Carlsen plays bishop a3, finally finishing his plan of getting that bishop into the game. And the bishops get exchanged, and now Carlsen has his eye on the knight saying, no, your queen does not want to go over to h5 right now because you're going to drop the knight with mate. Okay, so queen to c8 instead, and so Firouzja is trying to maybe come down here, maybe call check a couple times, get some counterplay, but Carlsen says, I've got plenty of time to stop all of your counterplay and continue attacking myself. So he takes the c file, queen goes back, knight e5 back to its outpost, king g8, queen f3. So Carlsen wants to push this pawn. He's threatening a fork here. Queen gets out of the way. Rook to f1 supporting the pawn. King h8. Queen e3 attacking the g5 pawn. Queen c8, again, maybe trying to get into the queen side here with check. So Carlsen just coolly plays rook to f2, and there's no entry at all on any of these squares for the black queen. So g4 is played, but that's not an issue at all after h4. Rook h5, knight f7 check, king g8, and after knight g5, nice little transfer of the knight to a more aggressive square, Alireza just throws in the towel and resigns. So what's the threat? What's going on in the position? Well, we can see white's pieces are very aggressively placed. For example, if black plays queen c4, then this is what could unfold. f7 check. King comes up to g7. If it goes in the corner, it gets mated immediately. If it goes up to g7, then check. It's forced up to h6, but then queen f6 check, forcing the knight to block. And you can even promote to a bishop for a nice pretty checkmate. So crushing victory for Carlsen against his young and upcoming opponent Firouzja. So after 7 rounds, we have 2 leaders with 6 out of 7 points, Grischuk and Carlsen. Right on their heels, half a point behind, we've got Nepomniachtchi, Duda, Jobava, Gelfand, Fedoseev, and Movsesian. So let's move ahead to round 8, where we see the 2 leaders clash. We've got Grischuk with the white pieces versus Carlsen with the black pieces. So Grischuk opens with the English opening, and we see e6 and a very quick transposition to a queen's gambit declined again. But this time Carlsen's opponent opts for the exchange variation. And then bishop g5, c6. c6 is an important move in the exchange variation. Not only does it lend support to the d-pawn here, but the point is black would like to develop this bishop, light-squared bishop, as soon as possible, but that would leave protection of the b7 pawn, and the move queen to b3 can be annoying, hitting both of these 2 pawns. So after c6, black says if you move your queen to b3, then I've got queen to b6 to stop your pressure on b7. Okay, queen c2 was played by Grischuk. Another move in this position that's very common is e3. But queen c2 is nice. I like it because the normal square for this light squared bishop is right on f5. So white says, no, you're not going to get your bishop there. I'm going to take control of that square right away. h6, bishop falls back, bishop e7, e3, castles, bishop d3, knight e8 asking for a trade of bishops. So in these kind of positions, black can get pretty cramped. White has a little more space for his pieces. This knight doesn't have its natural square. It's hard to develop this bishop anywhere. So black would like to trade pieces in these kind of Queen's Gambit positions. Bishop g3, so white says, no, I don't want to trade. And then an unusual move here, knight to d6. I think I probably would have played bishop to d6, insisting on the trade here, trying to get some minor pieces off the board to ease the congestion in my position. Knight ge2 could be a response, and black can initiate the trade, and then maybe move the knight to d6. That does look like a good square for that knight. But now the black dark squared bishops are off the board. Okay, but Carlsen knows a lot more than I do. He wants to keep the pieces on the board. So he's going to play a little bit cramped, but he's going for his chances. Keeping more pieces means possibly greater chances for victory. Knight ge2, rook e8, castles. Bishop f8 is a nice move here. One of the typical plans in this kind of Queen's Gambit exchange variation for white is to push his pawn to f3, which supports the pawn coming to e4. So we'd like to get a nice, strong pawn center here. So bishop f8 dissuades that. Can't push the pawn to f3 now because your pawn would fall on e3. Then a very interesting response I wouldn't have considered myself, bishop to f4. Now that looks very mysterious until you realize, oh, Grischuk is protecting that pawn, so he can push f3 if he wants to. Okay, so Carlsen plays bishop e6. He gets that bishop developed, not to an ideal square because this diagonal is controlled, but nevertheless it's off the back rank. And Grischuk goes ahead with his f3 plan, knight d7, rook a d1, and now b5. I love how Carlsen plays on the queen side, pushing his pawns forward. As the black player, I typically face the usual minority attack. These pawns kind of come forward and saddle me with a backward pawn or an isolated pawn, and I get into a lot of positional trouble on the queen side. Carlsen takes matters into his own hands, and he shoves his pawns forward and doesn't wait for any minority attack. e4, expanding in the center. Rook c8 is a move that the engines violently complain about and says that's just a terrible move. I don't know, maybe practically it's a fine move for the position, but the reason the engine says it's not such a good move is because white can kind of overrun black's position by taking the knight with the bishop. It's important to take that bishop off of the f-file because this pawn's going to come forward in a hurry with tempo. Black would have to take back, and then e5 comes, driving the bishop back, and then f4 comes, threatening f5 against that light squared bishop, trapping it. So black would have to maybe make a little room for that bishop, and then the f-pawn would push forward, the bishop would fall back, and white can even push the pawn to f6 here, breaking up the pawn structure on the king side, having a lot of space over there, potential for winning attack. So Grischuk may have passed up some opportunity here. Instead of taking advantage of rook to c8, he plays e5, which also looks good, gaining space, driving the knight back. But I think the difference is keeping that bishop in front of the f-pawn means that you don't have as many tempi as you would like to push that pawn forward and continue to expand. Okay, the knight goes to c4. Okay, and now the position is fine for black. It's about equal, the engine says. b3, Carlsen drops it back to b6, queen d2, b4. So again, he's just pushing his queen side pawns forward, usually something you see white do in this kind of position. Knight gets driven back, c5, pawns get exchanged, the dark squared bishop comes to life, and with these pawn exchanges, black is getting more room for his pieces. So white's in check, he slides his king over. f6, that's a double-edged move. Carlsen does want to break up this strong pawn here and get some room for his pieces, get some activity, but this is really allowing this bishop to have this strong diagonal, and in conjunction with this other bishop, I think Carlsen is actually inviting white to gain the exchange, as we will see. So white takes on f6, Carlsen takes back with the queen, and then the light squared bishop hits the rook, and the rook goes to d8, but then the dark squared bishop hits the rook. So Carlsen is, in essence here, sacrificing the exchange. Bishop f7, Grishchuk takes the rook, rook takes back, queen f4 offering a queen exchange, white is up material. Carlsen goes ahead and takes the queens off the board, bishop d6. Even though Carlsen is down the exchange, there are still a lot of pieces on the board. Carlsen has all 4 of his minor pieces, and he can be dangerous with that many pieces on an open position. Knight e2, knight c5 hitting the bishop, bishop retreats to d3, bishop to e5, rook centralizes, bishop falls back out of the way of that rook, bishop c2, d4, and now black is starting to get some good compensation for the loss of the exchange. This pawn is becoming dangerous, supported by his pieces here. It's a good passed pawn. Knight f4, knight d5, knights get exchanged, bishop e4, the rook falls back, knight d2, the pawn pushes again. So knight c4, bishop c3 attacking the rook, supporting the pawn to get all the way to the 7th rank. Rook e3, d2, rook e2. Now the engine favors black slightly. Okay, bishop takes the knight, so the knight cannot take the pawn. Okay, b takes c4. Okay, Carlsen takes the bishop off. And now I think it's a very drawish position. This pawn can be blockaded forever. There's not many winning chances on either side. Let's see how it finishes. a5, king g1. So the black pawns come forward, and black gets another passed pawn. Picks up the a pawn, protects his important passed pawn. And then we see Carlsen picking up that dangerous c pawn for his b pawn. And actually, at this point, white just decides to liquidate everything and get rid of both of these menacing passed pawns by sacrificing his rook and then getting the bishop forward in return. So now the position is completely quieted down, and Grishchuk does have an extra pawn, but I don't think it means anything. This is a pretty trivial draw for somebody of Carlsen's caliber. So we'll stop the game here. It's pretty uneventful. It does end up drawn after 70 moves. So after that 8th round, now we have 3 players in the lead, tied with 6.5 out of 8. We've got Duda, Grishchuk, and Carlsen. So let's go into the final round of the day, round 9. We've got Carlsen with the white pieces versus Jan Christoph Duda with the black pieces. Okay, so again, 2 of the leaders playing here, and Carlsen opens with e4, and we see a Sicilian defense, knight f3, and then the 6th most popular move in the position, knight f6. I've never played that myself. I've seen it a couple of times. It's a strange looking move. It invites white's pawn to go to e5, which it does. This, by the way, is called the Nimzowitsch variation. Nimzowitsch often invited white to overextend in the center, attacking knights, which get firmly placed in the center of the board. So there is some sense to this. The engine says it's okay. It's not that much worse than most Sicilians. So knight d5. Knight c3, I was thinking I probably would have tried something that grandmasters don't like, c4, and it's probably inferior. I would have pushed that knight back and then expand it with d4. I don't want to leave the d pawn back. I've got some weak squares here, but if I push it forward and exchange these pawns, then I like this kind of open position. But this pawn is kind of far out there and can be attacked. So back to the game. Carlsen plays knight to c3. That's the normal move in the position. The knights get exchanged. And now we've got open diagonals for our bishops here. We can get the queen out, castle queenside. Very easy development. Knight c6. h4, strange move, pushing the h-pawn. e6, bishop f4, queen c7, queen d2, getting ready for queenside castling. h6, bishop d3, developing the pieces sensibly here. Okay, the knight comes in and attacks the c-pawn. White takes the time to get the bishops off the board. Castle's long, queen c6, queen c3, bishop e7, rook d3, queen e4, hitting the bishop. So what is white going to do about this? Okay, he plays g3 to protect the bishop, and then knight a5, putting pressure on this pawn. It's attacked twice. Rook h d1, doubling the rooks. Rook d8, knight d2, attacking the queen. Queen goes to f5. Rook f3, lining up with the queen, threatening some discoveries here. Maybe bishop takes h6 comes to mind. And now black makes a very unusual move. Knight c6, just leaving the queen right there in line with the rook. There are a lot of tactics coming, a lot of calculations both players had to make in this position. And black saw this move, bishop takes h6 coming, with a discovery on the queen, seemingly winning a pawn. But here's the response. I did not see this coming. Knight d4, okay, leaving the queen there because black is threatening a royal fork to regain the queen. Okay, and what Carlsen ends up doing is taking the knight with his queen. Okay, a little desperado tactic there. Let's have a look at what would happen if he had taken black's queen with his rook. Well, then there's this knight e2 check, king b1, black takes the queen, and now black actually ends up the exchange, and white gets some pawns here. Looks like white has a couple pawns for the exchange, but his pawn structure is just terrible. Look at these triple isolated pawns here. So the engine really prefers black in that position. So instead of taking the queen, Carlsen decides to go for this desperado tactic, takes the knight, which allows black to take the rook. And so Carlsen is giving up the exchange in a different way under better circumstances. Let's have a look at what would happen if black had taken the queen. Then Carlsen would take the rook here. Black would, take the queen with his rook. Black would take the rook back. Bishop takes g7, rook h7, bishop f6. And again, white would have sacrificed the exchange, but his pawn structure is much better than it was before. So the engine slightly prefers white. So instead, black takes the rook, then knight takes f3, and black recovers the queen. Bishop takes g7, rook h7, bishop f6. And so Carlsen is down the exchange in another round this day. And he has compensation for it, though. If we count up the pawns here, he's got a 2-pawn advantage. In fact, Carlsen hasn't dropped a single pawn. Okay, so black takes the bishops off the board and then plays rook h6 to pick up the f-pawn. Knight takes d4, rook takes f6, f4, king e7, releasing the rook to slide over to the king side, rook d3, offering support to that pawn, rook c8, Carlsen defends, rook g6, knight e2, giving further support to that pawn, and then the rooks double up, putting pressure on g3, kind of tying down white's pieces. So Carlsen improves his king, d6, a4, e5, rook f3, rook g4. It's all zeros here. The engine says that white does have compensation for the exchange. King e3, king e6, king f2, lending further support, releasing one of his pieces for active duty. Rook a g7, rook e3 in line with the king. King comes forward to f5. Rook d3, king goes back to defend the d pawn. Rook comes forward, rook to g8, king f3, a6, rook d1, just shuffling the pieces around, king e7, f5, and now rook goes back to g7, and it's a little mysterious to me why black would make that move, allowing the following continuation. It's also mysterious that Carlsen didn't go for this continuation. So this is a blunder according to the engine. And here's what white could have done. He could have played f6 check, forking the king and rook, forcing the king to take the pawn, but leaving defense of the d pawn. And so white's rook picks up another important pawn here and is becoming very active. And so the position is in white's favor here. So Carlsen could have went for that. Now, after the rook fell back, Carlsen went for a different move here, rook d5, which I don't really understand, but the engine approves and says this is still an advantage for white, plus 1.8, just not as big of an advantage as that f6 move would have been. But now, this is another move I don't understand, king f6. Why is black going after this pawn at the expense of activating the white rook? I think black is just too intent on winning the position instead of holding a draw. Okay, so white does take the pawn and gets his rook very active here. Let's see how the game finishes. So rook d8, g4 check, rook takes g4, knight to g3 check. Okay, so this was a nice little trap here, putting the pawn forward on g4, calling check, offering that pawn up. But after black takes it and knight to g3 check, the black king can't stay in contact with the rook anymore. So the rook is forced to give itself up for the knight. And then e4 is played, rook takes a6, and white is up 3 pawns in the position. And black just doesn't have any counterplay at all. This e pawn is not dangerous, and the f pawn as well. White is just too fast with his pawns. He gets behind his passed pawn and pushes it. And then in this position, we see one more move by black, and I guess his flag fell or he resigned, I don't know which, but the move recorded is pretty strange. King d5, just allowing white to queen with check. Of course, that's equivalent to resigning. Okay, so Carlsen wins another game here in round 9, and after the second day is over, we have Carlsen in the sole lead with 7.5 out of 9. First time in the tournament that he has the sole lead. Closely on his heels, with half a point behind, is Abdusattorov, Grishchuk, and Nepomniachtchi. And I think tomorrow, round 10 begins with Carlsen versus Abdusattorov. Okay, thanks for watching the video.